Hi everyone, and welcome to another flight data sim tutorial. For those of you who are new to the channel, I'm a 737 training captain, examiner and instructor with a little over 8,000 hours logged in the real 737 and Level D simulator. In today's video I'll be talking about the Boeing 737 MAX and what's different in this latest 737 variant in comparison to the 737 NG. I'll be using the excellent iFly 737 MAX for Microsoft Flight Simulator, and I'll be following Boeing's technical document for pilots, that's FCOM2, as we cover all of the various differences throughout this guide. Now this isn't a conclusive guide, and I'm only highlighting the main differences, and as usual, if you are a real world pilot in training, please only follow the guidance from your approved training material. This is purely for entertainment only. So the first thing is just to talk about how general operating procedures haven't really changed much in the MAX. In fact, we follow the same SOPs as we do in the NG. We fly both aircraft currently at my operator, and the SOPs are exactly the same. The QRH, there's been some changes to some of the checklists as with some of the systems, but the memory items are exactly the same. The engines, which are brand new, sort of have similar qualities to how the CFM56 reacts these CFM LEAP 1Bs as well. The pitch settings are the same. The thrust settings, though, are considerably lower, about 8% for each phase of flight as well. But the same flying qualities exist in pitch, yaw and roll. So the first thing I wanted to point out whilst we're outside here is the nose gear. It's actually been extended a little bit in comparison to the NG by about 8 to 9 inches, and that's to actually accommodate these huge CFM LEAP 1B engines, which have a massive 69-inch fan. Now you actually notice this during the walkaround. You don't have to duck as much to get into the nose wheel when you're inspecting the nose gear there. So that's one of the major changes at the front here. So moving on to the winglets here, these are the advanced technology winglets. They're fitted to the 737 and it helps increase the aircraft's lift, thus reducing the fuel burn as well. They're absolutely huge. There's a bit of a fret with the fueling truck to ensure that they keep well clear of them as well, but they provide a fuel efficiency or a fuel burn improvement of almost 2%. So these are the technology advanced winglets, and you see a lot of the NGs now getting modified to have these retrofitted winglets as well. We can't stay outside without mentioning these awesome new engines. These are the LEAP 1Bs as well, which replace the CFM 56s, which were common on the NG as well. The fan blade diameter has increased from 61 to 69 inches, and the amount of thrust that it produces at sea level has increased to 27,000 pounds of thrust. I believe there's actually a higher thrust setting available from Boeing as well. So they're made out of carbon fibre, these fan blades. They're incredibly efficient as well. I think it's a reduced fuel burn of around 15%. CO2 emissions have been reduced significantly as well, and you have these awesome sort of blended exhaust parts here where the bypass fan comes out as well. That further reduces noise, so the noise has been reduced significantly as well in comparison to the NG. Now, because of the size of this engine, the amount of residual thrust available at idle is far more significant, which means that most gross weights, as soon as you release the parking brake, the aircraft just simply moves on its own. So usually you need hardly any, if any, thrust at all to commence taxi with this aircraft. Now, as I mentioned briefly at the start of this guide, the pitch setting for most phases of flight is exactly the same, but because of the size of these engines, the N1 has changed for most phases of flight. What you'll find is when you're flying this in Microsoft Flight Simulator is that the thrust setting for most phases of flight is around 7 to 8% less. So for example, when we're level at around 3,000 feet maintaining 220 knots in the NG, you needed about 55-60% depending on your gross weight. You'll find with the MAX you need around 48 to 52% approximately to maintain that same speed. So you'll just notice that the APU door has opened there. This is a new feature on the 737 MAX as I start the APU. It's the exact same APU in the NG, but the inlet door has been completely redesigned, and on the ground you'll see it's fully extended to the full open position. If we start the APU in flight, it's not as far open as this, but if we move to the rear of the aircraft as well, you can see the tail cone has been redesigned. That's to allow for a more efficient airflow, and again that brings further fuel savings of around 1%. So we'll now cover the air systems and what's different in the MAX in comparison to the NG. So in the NG, the engine compressor takes the 5th and 9th stage of the engine compressor for bleed air. It's now slightly changed the MAX with the LEAP 1Bs. We take the 4th and 10th stage, and that bleed source is then used to power various systems on the aircraft. The system's been completely changed as well, and it can detect and isolate faults on their own and identify incorrect air conditioning panel switch positions as well. So for example, if we do a bleeds off takeoff, there's a new bleed light which illuminates if we forget to reconfigure the aircraft. So here's the aforementioned light. So you have here, as we can test them here, 2 bleed lights. Previously they were called bleed trip off in the NG, and these lights have several different means as well. They can illuminate if you have the bleed trip off due to excessive bleed air or pressure or under pressure or temperature, a failure with the bleed air system, or incorrect configuration, as I just mentioned. This wasn't available in the NG. You'll also notice, as we look here on the overhead panel, the 2 blue ram door full open lights have been removed. That's simply because there was no checklist in the QRH, in the NG, nor the MAX, which actually involves checking those lights. So it was decided we don't need to know the position of the ram doors whilst we're in flight, or anytime we're in the aircraft. The backlights still exist, just like in the NG, just some slight logic changes. They'll also illuminate for some additional failures and also for misconfiguration, but that's also the same light as the NG. Another new light we have in the MAX as well is the Equip smoke light. That's not fitted to the NG as well. That will illuminate if smoke is detected in the equipment cooling system as well, which isn't applicable in the 737-800. So we've covered the air systems. Let's now discuss the anti-ice systems on the 737 MAX. In essence, not much has changed. There's just some subtle differences in the light logic, and there's also a brand new core anti-ice system, which is part of the CFM LEAP 1B. So what is the core anti-ice system? So it's an EEC controlled anti-ice system which is completely automated and transparent to the flight crew, and it directs bleed air through the engine core as needed. If there's a fault with that system, the engine anti-ice light will illuminate, and it's part of the checklist when we're trying to identify the fault. Here's the engine anti-ice lights. We can run the QH to see if there is a fault with that system. Those lights will also illuminate if there's a fault with the normal engine anti-ice system, and then we just complete the applicable QRH checklist as well. Unlike the 737NG, the valve indication lights for the engine anti-ice were blue. They're now amber on the 737 MAX, and there's been a slight name change as well. It used to be called Cal Valve Open, it's now called just Cal Valve. So when you turn the engine anti-ice on, it won't work on the ground, but you briefly get the Cal valve light illuminate and then extinguish, and then you just confirm thermal anti-icing TAI illuminates as just like with the NG as well. The wing anti-ice system logic has pretty much stayed the same, but again we've lost the 2 blue lights. We just now have L valve and R valve, 2 amber lights with the wing anti-ice. So we just simply turn it on. They should illuminate briefly, then extinguish, but if they stay illuminated, there's a fault with the system. It's either stuck closed or stuck open, and you complete the relevant non-normal checklist. Next we'll briefly discuss here on the ground the autopilot and the flight control computer. Again, works very similar to the NG, but there has been some enhancements. For example, if the stick shaker activates, the autopilot automatically disengages, so you can complete the stall recovery as well. The flight director bars will then remove in that instance. These are things I hope to demonstrate in the future in a flight tutorial of some sorts as well. And there's an inhibited autopilot nose-up trim when the airspeed is within the amber bar, the minimum manoeuvre speed. Communications is the next chapter to cover. There's absolutely no difference in the communication. If you still tune 1 to 1.5 in the cruise, you might occasionally hear a cow moo. Electrical systems are also completely unchanged in the 737 MAX. You can put the APU on the bus, generator on the bus as required, GPU, switch AC power sources as required as well. There's been some slight changes to the checklist in relation to the IDG, the integrated drive generator unit as well. So subtle changes involving certain switches that have to be removed. I think it's in relation to the cab util and IFE passenger switches, but apart from that it's exactly the same system as in the NG. So we briefly covered the engines outside. We talked about the fan diameter. We'll go in a little bit more detail about these LEAP 1B engines. So at my operator we have a 27k thrust rating, and the D rates are no longer 24k and 22k. They are 10% less and 20% less thrust than rated thrust. So you can see there, if I select FMC, go to the M1 limit page. We don't have this option for 28k bump, but you can see here 27k full, 10 and 20%. They're called TO, TO1 and TO2. That's one of the main logic changes with regards to the thrust settings in the FMC. And the EEC, electronic engine controls, are very similar as well. They have some additional features to allow for potential issues with the engine. They have something called TCMA and EOS. EOS is electronic overspeed, which prevents the rotors, M1 and N2 rotors, from overspeeding and shuts down the engine as well. There's something called TCMA, which is thrust control malfunction accommodation. That detects uncontrolled thrust events or high thrust events on the ground, and it'll also shut down the engine if that occurs. One of the most noticeable changes with the LEAP 1B is something called BRM, or bowed rotor motoring, which occurs during engine start. Now, this is caused by the N1 and N2 shafts bowing slightly due to thermal build-up after the engine is shut down. And what happens is, when you start the engine, you move it to ground, you allow the engines to spool up without entering any fuel, and when they get to approximately 20%, you get this motoring indication on the N2, and we just have to wait until that's extinguished. Once that's extinguished, and then the engine rolls up to 25%, we then insert fuel as usual. As I said, it's to reduce or remove heat from the engine. On the first flight of the day, typically it takes around sort of 20 to 30 seconds to motor. If the engine's warm, I've seen it take up to 2 minutes. We actually have a start limit of 3 minutes to allow for each engine start. So it is something that is quite noticeable. You take so much longer to start the engines on the Max in comparison to the NG. Have a little look at my YouTube short, which talks about in a little bit more detail what's going on with bowed rotor motoring. There's two new engine indication alerts, so if we zoom on in here, you can see you've got the top three, which haven't changed. You've got low oil pressure, which is illuminated here. This would be oil filter bypass, and then you have the start valve open illuminate here. There's two new ones here, thrust and fuel flow. The thrust will illuminate whenever the commanded thrust on the thrust levers is different to what you're getting. So if the thrust is set is more or less than the commanded thrust, you'll get this thrust light illuminate, and then you complete the applicable non-normal checklist. The bottom light here would illuminate fuel flow, and that would come on when the engine fuel flow is much higher than expected, and the QRH would then redirect you to go to the fuel leak engine checklist on the QRH. Moving up here and sticking with the engines, we have three master cautions associated with the reversers. We have reverser command. That's where the reverser has been commanded by the pilot to deploy in flight. So if you see that illuminate, you're a bit of a numpty. You have the reverser air ground light, which indicates that the air ground protection system has been lost, and then you have reverser limited, and that replaces the reverser light which you get on the 737NG, and that light indicates that reverse thrust is no longer available, and you're actually limited to just idle reverse. So that's pretty much covered some of the differences in the cockpit regarding the engines. We'll just now briefly cover the APU, which we looked at outside. You'll see the EGT gauge is no longer here. I actually really miss it, because when you start the APU you can't monitor the EGT and start progress. But if there is any problems, you have the same fault lights. A new light which is here is door, and this will illuminate based off the position of the door. So if it's not in the correct position, so for example if it's open in flight or on the ground and it should be shut, this light will illuminate. And we've lost the blue mate light as well. That's no longer on the 737 MAX. Next is the fire systems. They are exactly the same as in the NG. The same fire tests are completed, and if you have an overheat or fire on the aircraft in the engines, you'll get the appropriate warning. Same with the cargo fire system as well, and wheel well. So next we'll cover the flight controls. So the aircraft has been designed, as I said at the start, to fly just like the 737-800. The flight control system for pitch, roll and yaw is pretty much identical. One of the things which you will not notice in a desktop simulator is the rudder travel in the real aircraft is a lot less in the NG. It's actually not not really quoted anywhere in the manuals, but it is certainly noticeable when you're in the real thing that the rudder travel is nowhere near as much. One of the major changes with the flight controls is actually with the speed brake system. The speed brakes are completely now fly-by-wire, so they've replaced the traditional units and now have an electronic fly-by-wire system for the spoilers and a spoiler control electronic unit, and that saved a lot of weight as well, and it's allowed for some additional features with this speed brake. So one of those features is something I think you see in the 737-600 and 700. It's called MLA, or Maneuver Load Alleviation. So basically, when the aircraft's performing high G loads, 1.3 G to minus, or I think 0.3 G, it'll automatically stow the speed brake slightly to reduce loads on the wing. You won't see the speed brake move, that just happens on the wing, completely automatic. It's transparent to the flight crew. One of the neat features as well, if you're a passenger on a MAX, you might notice on short final the speed brakes deploy maybe just prior to touchdown. Now this is something called LAM, or Landing Attitude Modifier, and basically due to the way the MAX flies and these large engines, it would approach naturally quite flat. We want to make sure we have a slight nose up attitude on the flare to ensure that we touch down on the main gear. And what happens is when you select the landing flap 30 or 40, it will automatically deploy a little bit of speed brake to ensure that the main gear touchdown automatically, and again that is transparent to the flight crew, that the speed brake won't move. Lastly, and again transparent to the flight crew with the speed brake, is EDS, which is the emergency descent speed brake. So if you have a rapid depressurization and start descending very quickly, it'll detect that this is the case, and you pull the speed brake to flight detent. What happens is that the speed brake or flight spoilers extend slightly beyond the normal position, giving much higher rates of descent. Again, this is very evident when we're practicing in the sim rapid depressurizations and emergency descents, just to get down as quickly as possible. Speed brake extended light has changed as well. The arm and do not arm lights are over here. There's also an additional speed brake extended light, which you did get on the 800, but one of the nice features with this is if you have the speed brake extended and the thrust up, you will see the speed brake extend light illuminate to remind you to stow the speed brake. You never want to have speed brake with thrust out. It's like riding or driving your car with the brakes on. So another feature in relation to the speed brake system is the ELJA, the Elevator Jam Landing Assist, which is located just here. In a non-normal situation, you turn this on, and it basically provides a means of increasing or decreasing your descent rates when you're on approach and landing if you lose all pitch control or have a jammed elevator. It's something I hope to never use. You also have the ability to electrically move the stabilizer as well in a non-normal situation. So you'd move this with a jammed elevator. So let's have a look now at the pitch wheel, because we'll talk briefly about the speed trim functions as well. Just like with the NG, there is a stability augmentation system which encourages the pilot to return to the in-trim speed by trimming in the opposite direction as the pitch force. We then typically trim those forces out when it activates, which is usually high thrust settings aft weights. And a part of that system is MCAS. Now MCAS is obviously controversial. It was the precursor for the 2 MAX crashes as well. You'll be pleased to know it's been completely redesigned and now works as originally designed as well. It's not a tool to recover from a stall. It's not designed to do that. That's the pilot's job, but it's to aid with that pitch down moment as well. Control column forces also double as well when you drop below the stick shaker speed. Now when MCAS activates, it'll trim nose down, but now the logic has changed, so it limits that amount of nose down stabilizer trim in order to ensure there's sufficient elevator authority for the pilots. And once it's done its job and you've initiated the stall recovery, it immediately reverses that trim input. It's something we demonstrate during the max differences training for the guys that have just finished their type rating on the NG. But to reassure you, it is now working as designed in the real aircraft as well. Let's now talk about the flight instruments and displays. So on the 737 MAX, we have no longer 6 small displays which came with the NG. We have these very large 4 screens as well. They're called 2 inboard and 2 outboard, and this is now in common design with the 777 and 787 as well. One of the first things you'll notice here is the display information page here. This will show your call sign and your squawk, your cell call and registration. There are options to have additional information placed here if you so wish when you purchase your 737 MAX. The clock also appears here as well. There's the chronometer. You turn it once to start it, once again to stop it, and the elapsed timer is completely automatic from wheels off to after touchdown. The controls for the displays, if you have a display failure, can be manipulated using these, so you can have the most important information available. Similar controls were also available on the NG. The EFIS is again in a very similar design function to the NG. The range though no longer has numbers, it just has plus or minus, so you just rotate this as required. On the lowest scale you have 0.5 and on the highest you have 640, which you can see is all the way here. I don't have the IRS aligned, so there's no information available. You have the VSD, which if you select there is on the reduced mode. This ND has the no engine indications as well, so you can see VSD is nice and wide here. Again, watch some of my earlier streams to see the VSD in action. It's a fantastic tool for situation awareness and being aware of terrain. Whilst we're on the topic of engine displays, my operator pilot flying has the engine indications on their closest inner DU, and then so in this case it would be the captain pilot flying, and then we can switch this over. This would be the first officer pilot flying. We also have no lower DU, so a lot of the indications that were here were moved down. So the auto brake is down here for the RTO, and if we want to set bugs in the FMC, we press this info button, and then we can manually set V speeds if we don't have an FMC, for example, your M1 thrust settings as well, your VREF and gross weight too, using the switches here, the selector switches. Additional features which I hope to show in a different tutorial in flight is the autopilot roll saturation alerts and enhanced bank angle warning. So autopilot roll saturation, the autopilot on the 737 doesn't have any rudder input, it's only roll and pitch. If you basically saturate the autopilot by say an engine failure or rudder input, the aileron gets to a limit and it will advise you that you're reaching that limit and ask for you to apply rudder and essentially remove that saturation. Included in this situation is a roll-up set condition as well, so if the aircraft rolls violently, you'll get a command to roll left or roll right with an arrow on the PFD. Again, we'll cover this in a later tutorial. Let's now look at the FMC. Again, very similar in function to the NG, but if you select the progress page, you'll now notice there's 5 pages. This is the fuel progress page as well. You have 2 fuel figures, the totalizer and calculated. These should be exactly the same. If there is a difference, you probably have some sort of fuel leak or something that needs to be investigated. And the next value was the M1 limit, which we already discussed the different thrust settings earlier on in this guide. Let's now talk about the fuel systems. Pretty much nothing has changed with regards to this panel. We still have 2 main tanks and a centre tank, same quantities. Some slightly different logic or logic changes with the filter bypass. Again, you won't really notice that in a desktop simulator. The engine fuel warnings have moved here just to be below the totalizer fuel, so you have the usual ones of using reserve fuel, insufficient fuel, but there is a new alert, fuel disagree, which appears down here. This will appear when the totalizer fuel quantity and the FMC calculated fuel quantities disagree, so you need to investigate that further. Next is the hydraulics. Again, there's absolutely no differences in the hydraulic systems between the NG and the MAX. Just be very careful whenever you're on the ground turning on the electric hydraulic pumps. Make sure the bypass pins are installed and that there's no engineers working on the aircraft. One of the major changes to the landing gear system is the removal of the off function, which was fitted to the NG, so you had to move the selector to off during the after takeoff checklist to depressurize the A-line to ensure that the gear rested on the gear hooks, and that preserved the life of the uplock system, which was holding the gear in place after gear retraction as well. But otherwise the speeds are exactly the same regarding extension and retraction. In relation to the landing gear, we also have the wheel brakes. We just move outside here. All the Maxes, I believe, and certainly with our fleet, are fitted with carbon brakes. Again, in a desktop simulator, you're not going to really notice the differences here, but certainly in the real aircraft, when we're taxiing, it's quite hard to judge when the brakes bite, so it's quite sudden with the braking when you start braking lighter or lightly. But the brakes offer significant weight savings over the steel brakes, something around 300 to 400 kilos. So moving on to our final chapter, which is the warning systems in the 737 MAX. Now, the PSEU light has been removed in the MAX. We now have a new maint light which covers all the faults with the PSEU as well. It doesn't mean much to us. It simply illuminates 30 seconds from landing. We call the engineers and it illuminates for multiple different faults that need to be investigated by the engineers. We also have RAS, which we have fitted to our NGs, but they're also fitted to the MAX as well. They call it RSAT as opposed to RAT. RAS, Runway Awareness Alerting System. RSAT is Runway Situation Awareness Tools, and it's really well modelled in the 737 iFly MAX here, something I hope to demonstrate again in the future in a separate tutorial. So that's the end of my 737 MAX NG differences guide. I hope you found that interesting and learned something new. By no means is this a conclusive or comprehensive guide, it's just covering the main differences you might note and enjoy when flying the iFly 737 MAX in Microsoft Flight Simulator. Now, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe to stay up to date with the latest content, and I'll see you on another live stream or tutorial very soon. Cheerio!